Well, greetings, friends. I bet you were thinking, is this show ever going to start? I was driving back this morning, woke up very early to drive back to Calgary and then on to High River from Edmonton. One of our members, as you probably know, is Oilers Entertainment. So they treated us to a game between the Penguins and Oilers last night. And driving home, the roads were horrendous. So thank you for your patience. I had to be super safe. All of the trucks were stopped at the side of the road because they couldn't get down through this little coulee between Crossfield and Airdrie, or Carsfield and Carstairs, I think, without putting on their chain. So it's okay. Got here safe, and glad you were able to join us. We've got a couple of guests that we're going to talk to today. Dan McTeague is going to join us around after about the first hour to give us an update on what is happening in British Columbia. As you know, Dan McTeague is with Canadians for Affordable Energy. I think we were all anticipating that the Trans Mountain Pipeline would be back in operation to make sure that our friends in British Columbia have a secure supply of fuel. My understanding is it's about a third of their energy needs, and it's not back in operation. And I'm not sure when it's going to be back in operation. So we'll see if Dan can give us some insight on that and what it will mean for their recovery efforts. But first, I'm going to talk to someone who is not an environmentalist. She'll explain for herself why that is, but she is an environmental professional. And I had a chance to meet her a couple of weeks ago, and I thought you might be interested in knowing what the difference is between an environmental professional and an environmentalist, and how they can be used on various projects to help manage the various concerns that we have about mitigating environmental harm. But Jennifer Gosse is my guest, and she's here to help. Trust me, she's the founder and principal at Black Fly Environmental, and she joins us now to explain the difference. Jennifer, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Danielle. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. So I want to know how you came to this issue, because I've been calling myself an environmentalist, but I use that term reluctantly, because it does seem like when you are an environmentalist that aligns you with some of the more extreme elements that seems to be anti-development, anti-industry, energy, and I'm none of those things. So I'm not an environmental professional because I don't have a science degree. So we're going to have to come up with some term for me after we get through this. But tell us how you came into the type of profession that you have.
Absolutely. Well, I started at NAIT in Edmonton and got a technical degree, or technical diploma, I should say, in biological science. And I loved working outside. I didn't want to be behind a desk. I kind of wanted to get my boots on the ground and get my hands dirty. And so I started there and worked for a while. And then I went back to the University of Alberta and got a degree in environmental sciences. And fast forward many years later, here I am. I'm a professional biologist and a professional agrologist, and not an environmentalist. It's something that people say a lot because they don't really know what to call somebody who's a professional in the environmental world. And so environmentalist is, the most common and I guess easily accessible term. But really, to me, environmentalist means, like you said, it's associated with activism and kind of on the extreme spectrum of anti-development, and that's far from what environmental professionals like myself do. It's quite the opposite, actually.
Well, we're going to talk about what you do when you come onto a site, but I want to sort of scope out some of the big areas for concern when it comes to development, especially when you're talking about either big energy projects or when you're talking even about municipal development of rural. Because what brought me to environmental issues was landowner activism. So I was working with the Western Stock Growers Association and various landowners when I was with the Canadian Property Rights Research Institute, and we were watching legislation that was developing in the States that was being used as a pretext to stop development. So endangered species legislation, for instance. So you could find an endangered species of leopard frog, I think was one of the examples, that completely shut down a highway development. Also wetlands, that was also a big issue. And even just a puddle of water on a property could be enough of a pretext to stop any kind of development or use of that land. And I've been watching, because that takes me back to the 1990s, I've been watching as we've started seeing that kind of legislation replicated here. And I don't know if it's been enacted in quite the same way to do a complete stop on development projects, but I do worry that it can go in that direction. So I don't want to presume that Canada and the US are identical, but why don't we scope out a little bit about what the environment is like when you're approaching issues of trying to protect species at risk in their habitat? How do you look at that issue?
Well, fundamentally, you can things like species at risk and wetlands bringing a project to a screeching halt is a pretty rare phenomenon, and usually happens on large like multi-jurisdictional projects, like something like the Coastal GasLink or the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And that's because they have so many stakeholders that they have to please, and so many conditions of approval that they have to be mindful of when they're operating. And when you cross borders, you cross different landscapes, you cross traditional territories of First Nations, you have all of these different considerations. And I think that's when things start to get sticky and you end up in a situation where you're stopping work. But for the most part, if you're approaching a development in Alberta, the first step would be to engage an environmental consultant to kind of scope out what the regulatory requirements would be for your particular development. And there is species at risk legislation that gets reviewed. There are databases that are held by the provincial government that we know where these things are. And before you go and purchase the land or propose to do your alignment or whatever, your pit, whatever you're trying to build in your subdivision in an area, those are showstoppers that you can find out right off the bat in an easy desktop biophysical type assessment that we do tons of these. Blackfly does these, and we just pull from existing databases and data sets that are publicly available to tell you, if you want to put this here, these are the kind of things you're going to run into, and this is how you can manage them or mitigate them. Or if you move your site over, if you have that flexibility by 50 meters or something, you could probably be out of the margin of some of those things, and you don't even need to worry about it.
Let's talk about what some of those things are, because what they are because you've dealt with them. All I know for endangered species is that swift fox is, I think, considered extirpated in Alberta, and burrowing owl as well is one of the at-risk species. But that's the limit of my knowledge about the kind of species we've got to be mindful of. What do we need to be mindful of specifically in Alberta?
Well, in Alberta, there's, of course, we'll start federally. There's the federal species at risk list. The government of Canada says, like you're saying, the burrowing owl, it gets this status, and we know it it lives in a certain area and has its critical habitat, is what it's called. And anytime you propose to do any kind of development in that area, there's very specific environmental assessments that you have to do. And if you find them, there's timing restrictions. You may not be able to do your project in that area when it makes most sense for your development. But in Alberta, we have, the Alberta government has their own species listing for individual species in Alberta. So, I don't know, an owl might be endangered in BC, but here they have strong populations. So it's just listed as sensitive, meaning you have to go do a search to make sure when you clear your site, you're not going to cut down an owl nest, or that they're not detecting those species in that area. But other than that, that's kind of meeting your due diligence, is doing your assessment and reporting on it. And if nothing is found, then carry on, essentially. And if you do find something, it's usually waiting until the young have fledged. You can have a conversation with the province, Alberta Environment, these things happen all of the time, and come up with a mitigation strategy that still, protects the species, but allows the development to proceed.
I remember looking at the species at risk list because there were 2 endangered species of lichen that were on the list. And I just thought, my gosh, if we're going to have to go down to particular types of plants in managing and changing projects, we're going to end up in real trouble. But you must have some idea when a development is taking place, the kind of things that you're looking for. And tell us, what are the most common things you come across?
I was going to say lichen and rare plants are very specific, but there's a database where all of the places that have been searched and they have been previously found, you put in your like legal land description of where you want to do your development, and it'll tell you like, hey, we found this lichen and this plant here, and you go out and check to see if there's, hire biologists to go out and check to see if they're still there. And if they are, you can, there are strategies to mitigate that and upfront, instead of the chances of you finding a rare lichen or a rare plant once you've already like prepared a site and you're like, oh no, like what do we do now? That essentially doesn't happen because the guys operating the equipment don't really have purview into which plant is rare and which plant is is
well,
not.
I guess that's
right?
that's the problem, right? Because I think there's some pretty serious fines if you're damaging habitat and killing any species that are at risk. Tell us what those fines are, just so that we
Yeah,
know why it's so
well,
serious.
If it's a federally listed species at risk, I mean, it can be, it's more for a corporation than it is for an individual, but there are, I don't know off the top of my head, but I know that for an individual, it's in the tens of thousands, and for a corporation, it's in the hundreds of thousands, depending on the species and where you are. And this happens, and it's not just the monetary fine that you have to pay. It's now your reputation and your social license to do business on sensitive sites in the future, and the classification of a site as sensitive becomes more stringent kind of as time goes on, and people put more value on things like lichens and rare plant species, and bats and birds. I mean, there's always been protection for those species, but I find it's more at the forefront now than it was maybe 20 years ago.
And I think this is where you get into the misperception of your profession, is that I think what would happen is that if somebody was fearful that they had endangered species habitat, they'd say, we better not tell anybody and just hope we don't get caught.
It was called shoot, shovel, and shut up.
Yes. And so what can you say though I think people need to understand that if they call you, it's not so that you can come out and say, whoa, your highway can't be built or the subdivision can't go ahead. Your approach is very different. So explain how calling you in advance is far better than calling you in after some damage has been done.
Well, we have the skills and expertise, are not just me, I mean our team. Of course, there's a lot of specialists that look at different things for different environmental like scopes and components of an individual project. But you'll find out right away if you're in sensitive species habitat, if there's something sensitive in particular that's existing on the site or has historically, whether that's plants or species or water bodies that have fish in them. That's a big one. We can advise on that up front and say, hey, the government has this setback from that feature. So if you're going to try to operate within that buffer area, you're going to have to comply with X, Y, and Z. And sometimes, like I was saying, it's as easy as just moving your site over or changing the alignment or rotating your pad from a square to a triangle to cut the corner off, so you can meet those buffers without having to do any extra work. And like there's cost savings there, there's efficiency in regulatory permitting there, and you're doing more than just your due diligence. You're protecting the environmental features that interact with your development. I think people, like companies, are a lot more aware of the environmental sensitivities out there now than they were in the past. Like even in the past 10 years, a lot of things have kind of come to light, especially with these major projects that have been happening in Western Canada. But in Alberta specifically, wetlands are a kind of hot topic, or like a sensitivity that is really common. And if something has been plowed through for 50 years by a farmer, and you want to put your residential subdivision on top of it, the government still considers those puddles that have been tilled for 50 years wetlands, and you still need to treat them as if they're ponds with ducks and the whole ecosystem.
And I want to find out why that is, because that was one of the trends that I initially saw in America that I was worried would stop development here. And indeed, I mean, I think the case that might be most memorable from recent history for Calgarians anyway, anyone living in the area where the ring road was built, was that under the NDP government, there was a group of environmental activists who were concerned that building that highway was going to destroy wetlands. And so there was some kind of stalling of the project that took place, and then some commitment that for the certain number of acres of wetlands destroyed, there would have to be a certain number of wetlands created elsewhere. So it wasn't a showstopper, but I don't know the complication or difficulty in trying to, number one, work around all those puddles, as you'd suggested they can be that small. But then also, I don't know how complicated it is to create a brand new wetland to take the place of something that you're going to have to develop over. So can you talk about that?
Yes, I would love to. Actually, wetlands are one of my it's my background in my area of expertise.
Oh, good. So okay, yeah. maybe just because I don't want to have anyone eye rolling about the idea that there's a puddle in a farmer's field that is so precious that we can't possibly develop it, even though he's been tilling over it. Explain why that is. Why is it different?
Okay, so the province, you know, where do I start with this? So it's
why are wetlands even important? Is it because of birds, or is it because of some other reason?
Okay. So I mean, there's the biodiversity piece. So it's wildlife habitat, you know, birds and invertebrates, and you know, it's cover and food sources for various species of wildlife. But more than that, it acts as flood mitigation. As a flood mitigation tool. So, I mean, people refer to these as the ecosystem services of a wetland. It's not just, you know, fuzzy bunnies, like I like to say, and trees and things like that, but there's real value in the wetland's ability to filter to filter water through the soil and cleanse the water, and to retain water and act as a buffer when there's extreme weather. Like, I'm going to use Calgary as an example. The flooding that happened when there was a lot of research into how wetland loss in the city of within the city of Calgary boundaries contributed to the amount of water that made it to the river, and the loss of wetlands. Maybe I'm not saying this correctly. The loss of wetlands and the ability of the landscape to percolate water was a large contributing factor to the, you know, increasing the velocity in the river that ultimately caused all the damage. And so if I want to put this in dollars, if you are in northern Alberta and you want to remove some wetlands to build something, it's $19,000 a hectare. Okay. If you are in the city of Calgary, and first of all, they permit you to remove a hectare of wetland, it's $250,000. And these costs go up based on the value of the wetland. So the government can decide, after your consultant has come and done an assessment and said, these are the wetlands that are on the property, there's a whole process that you follow. They look at it and essentially give that those wetlands on the property, an appraised value. And if they're cultivated prairie pothole, you know, I don't want to say low value, but essentially low value wetlands in comparison to, you know, the region, then they get a 1-to-1. So that's $19,000 a hectare times however much land. That's how much money that you pay to the province in compensation to permanently remove that wetland. So, but if it's a really valuable wetland, say, and the things that they consider value are not just environmental. If people like to kayak on them, if it's near if it's near species at risk habitat, like there's all these different features that factor into how the government does their appraisal, but they can go all the way up to 10-to-1. So $19,000, like more or less, if it's a 10-to-1 wetland, becomes $190,000. And if you're in the city of Calgary, where it's $250,000 per hectare, you can, it just amplifies depending on where you are. And that's because there's been such high historical loss, which has led to a reduction in the services that wetlands really provide people, but maybe they're not as visible as, not everybody understands that, and it's not as at the forefront. I think.
So, okay. So is it really just a monetary penalty, or can't you say, look, if we've got 10 hectares that we are going to be impacting for wetlands, can we build wetlands elsewhere? Can you do it that way?
Well, that was a policy that was being implemented a few years ago, but now traditionally the money would go to Ducks Unlimited, and they would do projects and wetland restoration and enhancement projects around the province. And then recently, in 2019, the government of Alberta said, we're taking this money and we're going to tender out projects so that everybody can compete. And they have very specific criteria of, these are the engineering standards, these are the design, the planting, the whole thing of what they want to see for their constructed wetlands. So there's a guide that'll tell you what their expectations are as a to compensate for the wetland loss if you want to construct a wetland. And recently, just in 2020, they have just started distributing this money, but it hasn't been through a competitive tendering process as far as I can see. I have not seen anything come out. It's been given to municipalities and not-for-profits and Indigenous groups to work within their boundaries to do projects that benefit them and their residents.
Is that the kind of thing that if it was a competitive process, would a company like yours be the kind of company that would bid on it?
Yes, we actually gave a conference presentation on this program in 2019 for the Alberta Sand and Gravel Association, because who better, to take advantage of a program like this, the people who are left with a hole in the ground filled with water at the end of their operation, right? But it hasn't been as visible, and it hasn't been as transparent, I guess, and the funds haven't been distributed in a way that's equitable. I don't want to put my foot in my mouth and make it.
How about this, so that you don't put your foot in your mouth, but we can get some progress? What would be a better process? What would need to happen for companies like yours to be able to participate in it?
Yeah, if they tendered out the projects on Alberta Purchasing Connection, just like highway projects and all the other infrastructure upgrades, why would this program be any different? And I know that they want the wetlands to be managed, and they think the best way to do that is to have municipal government do it. And I think for some municipalities and cities, that's excellent. But let's face it, not all municipalities and cities are created equal when it comes to environmental expertise. And so they do partner with consultants, but some just don't have the capacity to take advantage of these programs. And I met with the coordinator for this program recently, and she was saying that it was undersubscribed. So they gave presentation at the Urban and Rural Municipalities Forum. That's not the correct name, but there's a conference that goes on, an annual conference, and they gave presentation to try to get more involvement. But I mean, it's not open to for-profit corporations. It's only for government, Indigenous groups, and not-for-profits. And so I think they're kind of not reaching as many communities as they could if they put it in the hands of the businesses to then find the clients to do the projects. I think they'd have a lot better product at the end.
So tell me how you would address that issue of the long-term stewardship. So you create is it enough to just create the wetland and then move on to the next project, or is there a long-term stewardship issue? I can understand why the government might think they need to go through an official entity, but maybe explain that to me.
Well, so if the government gives you this, as my understanding is right now, the government funds this wetland construction project, you construct the wetland, and you have to do this verification and validation process to make sure that the wetland is on track to perform ecologically and provide the ecological services that you proposed in your project, and that it's acting as a wetland, and the restoration of flood mitigation capacity and biodiversity and these things. And then after that, there's a sign off, and I believe it's 10 years that it essentially can't be disturbed again, but it becomes owned under the Alberta Water Act. So that wetland now is regulated just like a natural wetland. So if after the 10-year period, a development corporation wants to come and put a subdivision next to it, and there's a portion of it they want to remove, say, then they can apply through the regular process, just like it was a natural system, to do that. So it's not that it's like on the landscape and you can never do anything to it again. There's just kind of a period of time where now it's, you know, it's met its targets and it's performing and it's giving those services, and then now it's owned under the regulation just like every other wetland, and it carries on. So it's not
Okay,
like,
so I've got some sand and gravel members. So I'm kind of interested in knowing, when you say that it's kind of a no-brainer that taking the sites that they have extracted from seems to be an obvious place to build a wetland. Explain that to me. So tell me what you would do if okay, so I'm government. I've changed the policy and I'm putting out to bid and I need a bunch of wetlands. Bang, you're hired. What are you going to do?
well, okay, if you're sand and gravel, like you're saying, the problem is your NPIC lake is going to be quite a bit deeper than 2 meters, which is what the wetland policy, the construction wetland policy considers like functional area. So anything that's deeper than that is not going to qualify. And I think that's one of the problems. Also, the government was in consultation with the Alberta Sand and Gravel Association and, you know, a lot of these large industry groups when they developed the construction directive. And like I said, we gave a presentation at the conference, and then at the last minute they came out and said, actually, this is only for residential subdivisions, because I think that the scope and variability of what they would have to do to meet everybody's demands was so broad that they're like, at this time, we're just doing it for this small group of people, because they build stormwater ponds for surface water retention in the, you know, and to walk your dog around and these sort of things in subdivisions anyway. Like, they have to do it as a design to manage the runoff. So it's just kind of, if you build it in a little more ecologically friendly way, you can save yourself some money as a developer in that sense. But it has been promised, and I believe they're working on coming out with these directives for other industries, specifically oil or sand and gravel, because like I said, they're kind of ideal candidates for these restoration projects.
So talk to me a little bit about that, because you and I, when we met for lunch, I was telling you one of the videos that I saw that has just really stuck with me. And I don't know why the industry doesn't do a better job of championing these success stories, but it was the Cheviot mine and Share It. And so they showed the before and the during, and yeah, it was a big ugly hole in the ground. And then they showed the after, and it was beautiful landscapes that had multiple different levels and layers. And there's a bighorn sheep that was using it, beautiful grasslands and lots of biodiversity. And I thought, this is the model, is that it's not, you can't ever touch landscapes and do extractive industries at all. It's when you're extracting, have as little environmental impact as possible during the project, and then return the land as close to its natural condition as possible, as quickly as possible afterwards. That seemed to me to be a pretty good guiding principle. But I don't know if we have a lot of examples of that. That's the one that sticks out to me, the Syncrude collaboration with the Fort Mackay to build the Bison Ranch. That's another one that stands out to me. Is there barriers to encouraging that kind of reclamation of the landscapes, or are they just not celebrating things that are going on?
I think it's under-celebrated. I mean, maybe in the 80s and early 90s, there wasn't as much of a focus on what the expectations are of any industry in terms of reclamation. But nowadays, it's planning before you're allowed, like, it's part of your permitting process. So before you're even allowed to put a shovel in the ground, you have to say you're going to meet X, Y, and Z once you're done. And I mean, you don't need to have it down to the detail of, which plant you're going to put where. But there's been a lot of research over the years that has improved reclamation strategies and timing. And like you're saying, there's the Cheviot mine, for instance. I visited that site maybe 15 years ago, but they have how do I say this? They have kind of tailored their reclamation for the species that were there before that they had an impact on, like the sheep. And I know that there's I can't think of it right now, a species of duck that was there, very sensitive previously. And I know they built some like overpass structures where they used to nest, and like a large culverts, and they can do like environmental engineering essentially to enhance habitat for to focus on a certain species that maybe they've altered the habitat that was there previously. So I think that this is an expectation. It's a government regulation, and it's happening everywhere. It's just not, it's not publicized. And the things that get in the news are negative. The environmental activism, you know, showing some damage that happened to the environment, or look at this giant landscape that has been ripped open and mined. And yes, I understand the optics and how that you know, how that looks, and it is damage to the environment. There's no doubt about that. But these operators and industries are experts in planning their reclamation, and it's not like they just get to extract and then move away, like, which has happened in the past, but nowadays, no way. Like,
you know what, you've sort of planted a seed with me that perhaps we need some new measurables, that maybe we need to start measuring how many hectares of landscapes have been restored, how many wetlands have been created, how many endangered species have reemerged on the landscape because of the actions of companies in doing this. And that, you planted a seed with me. Let me think about that. I've got somebody making a comment here, and since we're going to move into a discussion about what happened in BC, I've got somebody saying Sumas Plain is a drained lake. Actually, it's an inland delta, which is supposed to flood regularly, and this is why the soil is so rich there. And I wonder how many places we have like that wetlands were ideal because they were turned over to farming. But if you can't maintain the infrastructure to be able to support that, you end up with catastrophes like we're seeing in British Columbia. Do you have any sort of examples or thoughts on or maybe just even commenting on what that listener brought up?
Actually, I just read a little about Sumas Lake yesterday. That's ironic that is the comment. And it was drained for a gold mine, I believe, or for a mining operation back in the 1920s. And then they built housing over it. And like you're saying, without the natural buffer of a lake, or you drained a wetland area, it doesn't mean that the water is going to stop coming there. It could be groundwater, you know, springing to the surface. It could be, you know, excessive precipitation. But these events happen, and I guess when you remove a system or drain a lake or drain a wetland, you're really removing the capability of that land to manage that precipitation, and that ends up impacting people. So, you know, things like climate change, and they talk about extreme weather events, whether you believe that is human induced or not. The fact is, these things are becoming more frequent, and because there's more people in the world, more people are being affected by these extreme events, and the flooding in Calgary, for instance. And I have a friend who's a home builder, and he was working near Sherwood Park in Edmonton on the east side of the city, and there was a big flood. I think this was in 2011 or 12, and all of these people's decks were floating, and there was a couple of on this one street, and there was a couple of houses where the deck was still level, and he kind of knocked on some doors and asked, hey, I've been asked to do kind of an investigation on what's happening here. And it turns out that those people had deeper piles than the others, and this whole area at one point was a wetland, like a small lake essentially. And back in the 70s, when they developed it, they just pushed dirt into it and drained it and moved on. But then with all of the rain, underwater or underground, the water still pools there and pushed everybody's deck piles up, and everybody had to get their backyards redone, essentially. And
that is a perfect example of why it is we need to be aware of wetlands and try to work around them rather than pretend that they don't exist. It's sort of tricky, though, because once you've got a bunch of development that has occurred and you've got existing cities, I don't know what you can do other than just rebuild the infrastructure. I mean, if we were having this discussion about Sumas Lake today, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been drained. I don't know if that's
no.
I just don't think that would be in sync with our environmental understanding today. But now that it has been, you have to make the choice of, do you start relocating people or do you rebuild the infrastructure? We have made those hard choices in High River. People said, it's called High River. You should have known that it was maybe not the best place to build. But what ended up happening is, sure enough, there are two major communities that got pulled out, and returned to the river. And the berming system as well got repaired. So High River, might I just say, I believe is the safest city in Alberta because all of the flood mitigation is done. But there were tough decisions that had to be made about saying, nope, sorry, you just can't build there or rebuild there again. What do you think ought to be done about these places that we know wouldn't fit best practices today? Do you have anything to do with those kinds of challenges?
Well, I know that the Alberta government spent a lot of effort and money after that stemmed from the flooding in Calgary on emergency management and like not just how do we deal with it if there was a flood or some major extreme weather event sort of thing, but like how do we rally people up and keep them safe? What do we do? What are the next steps? How do we communicate with each other? And so there's these like emergency management plans that have come out. I don't know a whole lot about that program, but I have seen that as kind of, in my mind, that is one step to at least increase the preparedness of a community that maybe is built on something that today we would never put a community on the edge of a river where we know it's going to flood once every 25, 50, 100 years. And beyond that, the strategies are really, getting creative with infrastructure just so it can handle extremities and environmental enhancement projects. If you ask, like wetland construction to help kind of buffer some of the extreme potential for these systems that have already been damaged, and that's why. Like I was talking about the funding that the Alberta government have and giving to municipalities. They're trying to focus. They have areas of the province that are focused where there's been high historical loss. So the restoring the function in those areas is a priority, and that's where they're trying to inject the most dollars.
That makes sense, but you can do both. I want to ask you, I don't know how wide your area of expertise is on the issue of caribou, but caribou is being put out there. It feels, I think, to the energy industry as almost that kind of sample species that will be used to stop development. I think that's how people are worried it's going to be used, is that when you start looking at the herds, and they have some very small herds in some places, is that enough to stop development in an area, or can that be worked around? How do you see that caribou issue, or how would you approach it?
Well, okay. Caribou is an extremely sensitive species, and they're, how do I put this kindly? They are not great competitors to their peers like moose and elk and deer. They're not as hardy. They're dumb and they get eaten by wolves, and they're not as adaptable as, like you have a city and there's deer running through and a moose runs through your yard. And as Canadians, these are things that we're kind of used to seeing, but that doesn't really happen so much with caribou unless you're like way, way in the north. And so they're really sensitive to development, first of all, and they're really sensitive to predation, which makes them the first to get removed from the system. And it doesn't mean that they're any less valuable. It just means that there's more management that needs to happen, which has been. And also their preferred ranges that overlap with some of the biggest oil and gas reserves. And so, companies want to explore these areas. And when they cut seismic lines in and develop roads, those are essentially superhighways for wolves to come and get the caribou. And so it's really hard to manage that. I mean, the government does have restrictions on, but they're flexible, but like you can't work in a certain time of year in a certain area because in the winter, for instance, because they're the most sensitive, they have the least food. And so there's restrictions on that. And caribou is a difficult topic. Like nobody wants to be responsible for the extirpation of caribou. And they have a very important ecological and like significance to Indigenous communities that needs to, and there's the value of just having the species on the landscape is something that is difficult to, I don't know, to manage.
No, it makes sense. I mean, part of the reason why we have so much cattle in the prairies because we have so much bison there, and we need to have cattle there now that we don't have bison to just maintain the biodiversity of the area. So I'm assuming as you go further north, that's kind of the role that the larger caribou herds would play. So you think that it's a matter of managing around timing as opposed to saying you can't build or construct anything here at all?
Well, it's a lot of things. Like it's a mixture of them all, because also the caribou have a very large home range and they migrate vast distances, and it's hard to manage something that is like that's that movable, that's that sensitive, that overlaps with these areas that are also their food source is like old growth. They need like old growth lichens that grow on trees. That's their main food source. So if we go and do forestry and clear a bunch of those, it's also where clear a bunch of these areas, then we've also removed their food source. So there's multiple factors that come into play, and I know that they're top of mind for management in terms of the government, and that industry is very aware and very good at trying to mitigate as much as possible. But are they stopping development in Alberta right now? Maybe they.
I think there's that fear because I think that there's this fear because the federal government is taking a keen interest in expanding their authority over that area of regulation. But I guess the other way of looking at it is that if we could demonstrate that we're expanding caribou habitat somewhere else, that might, can we take the same kind of approach that we do to wetlands?
Not really, because they're distinct subpopulations. So I have heard, I am not a caribou biologist. There are people who are experts in this and could, give you all of the details. But I have heard that there is programs where they are penning and basically removing the predation and feeding the caribou so that they can have young and then releasing them, because they're extra sensitive when they're calves to everything, the elements and wolves and all of these things. And so they're trying to increase the population by giving them a hand up, essentially, by removing predation and increasing their food sources so they can boost the population and that way. And by the way, like fencing and operating something like that is not it's not an easy operation. It's in a hard area. It's very expensive. So there is a lot of effort that's going into conserving caribou and helping their populations while still allowing the development to happen. But I understand the fear of the federal government coming in, because when it's a SARA, like a species at risk, they do have the jurisdiction to come in and say, okay, Alberta, we don't think that you're doing a good enough job, and now we're going to take the reins and we're going to tell you what happens. And that is a valid fear that could happen, and I know that nobody wants to see that, but I think that's why there is so much investment in caribou protection and caribou planning and timing, and like I said, these programs, because the industry is not oblivious to these things. They don't want to be responsible for damaging caribou herds. They just want to be able to do their business. And so they're trying to strike a balance between them both. And the effectiveness is, I don't know.
Well, one of the things I'm hoping I can get your support on is we've been advancing an R-Star credit program to try to get full reclamation of oil and gas sites, because the sense that I'm getting is that we've got a lot of wells that have been inactive, but it's so hard to get a reclamation certificate off of those sites that we do a lot of downhole abandonment, but the surface reclamation and the vegetation management are things that aren't getting done. But that's the thing that you can see, and that's the thing that the landowner can see, and that's the thing that environmentalists can see. And it feels like that there isn't enough effort being put on that. So our notion, and I talked to you a little bit about this, is that if you can provide a credit so that when someone does, say, $100,000 worth of reclamation, then when they do new drilling, they'd be able to have a lower royalty rate until they make that money back. And then we would get this really, I think, healthy cycle going, where the more you reclaim, the more you have money to drill with the newest technologies, which are more environmentally friendly and less impactful on the environment, which allows you to reclaim more. And so we'd be able to create both jobs on both sides. That's what it is that we're hoping to do. But tell me a little bit about why it's complicated to get a reclamation certificate on a well site. What needs to be done to be able to improve it? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I can. Again, that's not my area of expertise, but
it will be if we get this program going. You're going to be called up to recover all kinds of well sites.
I'm not I do a lot of wetland work and vegetation work and permitting, but I obviously have experience in that realm, so I can speak a little bit to reclamation of oil and gas sites in particular. But the decommissioning, so the cutting and the capping of the site is kind of the low hanging fruit. That's like the minimum you have to do to be able to carry on, and the liability of that site is still there. And I think the problem with incentivizing, like over COVID, there was all of these federal and provincial incentives to put, abandoned sites to bed, was that it takes time to meet the criteria for of the surface. So they call it the equivalent land capability. So you're not going to grow a 30-year forest and be on the hook for 30 years for that, square to meet that. But you have to be able to show it's on its way. It's meeting the criteria. So if you're in forested land or cultivated land, there's different criteria for the surface that you have to meet. But that still takes time. It can take years. And then you have to send people like environmental consultants out to make sure that it's, to validate essentially your site. And before you can get a reclamation certificate, you have to be able to prove certain standard, like to meet certain standards. And I think that the initial, take out, like cut it, cap it, it's no longer producing, it's still a site, we'll move on and we'll spend our money elsewhere. But doing the reclamation is time consuming, and it's a liability that, industry wants to get off of their books, but it's also something that you can't make it go much faster than a tree will grow.
Well,
unfortunately.
But tell me about some of the technologies that are developing, because I've heard of some, so you must have too. I mean, I love talking about Wild and Pine because they're a company that has found a way to plant seedlings in a controlled environment with the latest hydroponic technology so that they can have specific soil from the place where it's going to be planted in a specific bed. So it's all the same little seedling brothers and sisters that are going to go to the same place, simulating the same kind of lighting conditions that are happening currently, so that when you do take them out and plant them, they've got at least some buildup of hardiness so that they can survive. And it seems to me there's probably all kinds of technologies out there that would allow us to do a better job of reclaiming these landscapes. And it's a matter really of getting started, because once you get started, that's really when that expertise will develop. Do you have any other examples?
I think there's a lot more. Okay, so the Alberta government has standards on, like you have to have this many species compared to what's, directly outside of your site. And it has to be this density, and you can't have this much weeds. Like, it's very black and white. And I feel that the environment often operates in the space of gray. And I think that I think there's a lot of opportunity to get creative in that space of, okay, so where is this site, and can we return it to something that's maybe not exactly like the land next to it, but maybe it has other values and uses. For instance, I was working with an Indigenous group recently in the north, and they were saying, we have this site, it's abandoned, or not abandoned, sorry, it's essentially, it's in the process of being reclaimed, and we don't really want it to go back to the forest. We would like to use it as a seniors lodge. Like, can we bring in a like a modular building and use the road that's already there and put that there? And I thought that was an excellent idea. And it reduces costs for the industry, like the operator. Obviously they don't have to, and it removes their liability. And there's all of these pieces that could kind of come together. I mean, another one that the same community suggested is, could we create an area for berry picking? So plant like berry bushes essentially in this area. So we have something that's kind of, concentrated and close and accessible for elders to go and collect different berries. So instead of putting it back to, I don't know, like a spruce and aspen forest, you can plant blueberries and raspberries, and they're still native species to Alberta. So they're still, they integrate with the existing ecosystem there. We're not bringing in raspberry bushes from, Hull's greenhouse or something. So they're still usable by wildlife, and they're adapted to northern climates and things like that. But I thought that was really interesting, and I'm sure there's been some of that has happened in the past. I'm certain of it. But again, it's one of those things that's not celebrated. Like, you have all of these well sites, you need to do reclamation. Okay, I'm going to meet the criteria. It's going to take me a couple years. I got to get consultants out there to prep it and review it and submit all my documents. What if you could have more of a like a community-based or I don't know, creativity.
Or even a landowner base. I mean, in the case of an
Landowner
Indigenous community, you'd have the community weigh in. But in the case of the landowner, maybe the landowner would have some thoughts about what they want it to return to as well. And there
Yeah,
should be
and
some flexibility on that.
that does happen a lot. Like they'll seed it to whatever the crop is or things like that. And then the landowner can sign off, and that's kind of their meeting their due diligence in terms of returning the land to their equivalent land capability. But that's an area like I was like the what we were talking before about reclamation, that's kind of under celebrated. Like it's something they're regulated to do, but it doesn't get much visibility. And I mean, when a large mine, does great reclamation that reduces line of sight for caribou and things like that, that gets put in the news. Or if there's a new technology that somebody is using on a major pipeline project, that'll get publicized. But the everyday, good reclamation that happens in Alberta is just kind of getting pushed to the side, if you ask me.
Well, I'm glad to know that there is so much more going on that we're not celebrating, and because there's always an opportunity to fill that information gap. Let me just put one more thing on the table from Francois, because this is, I think, a frustration. It says caribou important, but what about migratory birds and bats that get decimated by wind farms? It does seem like if a bird gets killed in the context of a municipal development or a highway or an energy development, then it becomes headline news. But if birds get killed in the context of the operation of wind turbines, it seems like that's not even a factor. And I don't know if you can explain why there's that difference, or should we be trying to have some similar parity? Are there ways that we should be looking at citing wind farms and solar panels to make sure that they meet the same level of biodiversity concern?
And I think that's a very important issue, like a very important topic. And I feel like there's this push to move to renewable energy. And there are, like, in terms of birds and bats, there's very specific multi-year assessments that have to happen before they're allowed to permit and build and operate those types of energy developments. But the environment is dynamic, and I should say the species are dynamic. And just because you didn't catch it in year 1 or 2 doesn't mean that they're not going to show up in year 3 and 4 and get damaged by solar panels or wind farms. And there are a lot of damages to those species from those developments. And I think it's something that there's a lot of research on, and there's more and more focus. And there was I think in the beginning, there was a lot of push for renewable energy, and there was a process to follow, and everybody followed the process. And now that they're up and running, they're kind of finding all of these unforeseen environmental impacts that now they're trying to manage after the fact. You're right, though, when you say, like maybe it doesn't get publicized as much as like a tailings pond that kills hundreds of ducks. It's very true that birds and bats are very sensitive to wind turbines, to solar. Even at the airport, like, you don't hear about those things.
Unless you happen to be an unlucky person who ends up running into a flock as your plane's taking off. Jennifer, you've been a wealth of knowledge. I think the takeaway I have is I'm an environmental professional and I'm here to help. That it's better to contact you before a project to get some advice on how to manage and mitigate against potential harms, rather than have an oopsie and have to call you after the fact.
It'll save you time and money.
Fantastic. Jennifer Gosse, thank you so much for being with us. And as I mentioned, Jennifer is a principal with, there we go. She was the founder and principal of Black Fly Environmental. They are just growing by leaps and bounds. I think she said that they're now up to 24 environmental professionals doing the kind of work that biologists do. I hope that gave a little bit of insight into that. All right. My next guest, one of my favorites when I was on radio, Dan McTeague. He initially was with Gas Buddy when I started interviewing him. He is now with Canadians for Affordable Energy. And oh my goodness, we got a big affordability problem happening with our neighbors to the west in British Columbia. Dan, I know you've been following that very closely, and the restart or pending restart of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the impact of what it's going to mean for gas prices. I'm so delighted we can talk through some of these things today. I would love to know if there's anything governments should be doing that they're not doing, anything that industry should be doing they're not doing, or is it just a matter of a waiting game? So thanks so much for being with us today.
Good to be here, Danielle. And yes, I mean, it's been a rather interesting couple of weeks, and certainly by no means leaving Canada exempt from the idea that it can't face these kind of challenges, and that it's met those challenges very much head on. Hats off to the workers in British Columbia who have been steadfastly working not just to get the pipeline assessed, but also the rail lines, the highways, the roadways, and of course, to a large extent, it might not be well known to many, but suppliers of fuel in the Lower Mainland have literally had to do cartwheels to get product in, to get the province to drop waivers when it came to renewable mandates. Bring in mixing ethanol. These types of things just can't be done by wishing these things away. But I think what it's done is it's really underlined, thankfully, the importance of fossil fuels, hydrocarbons, and pipelines for part of the country. I think that for many respects, without being too difficult on them, was taken for granted.
Well, I think so too. I mean, we've always been worried about what happens when Trans Mountain finishes that final leg in Burnaby. Are people going to be up in arms fighting against it? I wonder if this might change that conversation a little bit.
I think it will, but it's
yeah.
not going to change the dynamic, the political dynamic. I mean, there's a lot of money, as the report that was brought out a few weeks ago demonstrated. You're not going to get Dogwood and Tides and 360 and all these other organizations to back off. But I think politicians need to be, laser focused on the end goal, which is to ensure adequacy of supply, to ensure that what we have here, the benefits that we have here in terms of resources, are done and delivered in an affordable, sustainable way. And I think we're doing that. And I think for organizations that are heavily involved with, damming the torpedoes and blocking pipelines and agitating, I suspect that we may want to spend a bit more time in this country looking at legislation on what actually constitutes a charity. Because if charity is activism, then I think I have every expectation that my experience, several years as a politician, some enterprising MP is going to push this through. You have to. I mean, these are not folks committed to helping the poor. These are people committed to obstructionism. And of course, the crisis in British Columbia, I think, has driven home the reality, not the fantasy, but the reality that we cannot do without natural gas and oil, like it or not. And it's part of our makeup as a society. And our ability to use it responsibly is manifest.
Let's talk about both those.
I'm happy with the result so far.
I want to talk about both natural gas, because I think there's some aggressive policy that the federal environment minister is proposing, and that is one issue. But with Trans Mountain in particular, if my memory serves correct, because you've educated me a lot on where Vancouverites get their gasoline and diesel and aviation fuel from, I gather that it's about a third of what they need comes through the Trans Mountain pipeline. Am I correct on that? And what is happening now? Where are they at? Where are they getting the extra supply, and where are they at on shortages and rationing?
It's 2/3 actually. And it's not just 2/3 of all what Lower Mainland Vancouver Island needs. It also supplies about a third of all of the Washington state refineries that supply really in Oregon and Washington state, and to a very small extent, even British Columbia, Lower Mainland's fuel needs, because there's a lot of trade between the Parkland refinery. So 2/3 is nothing to sneeze at. In fact, if you take 2/3 and you add rail, it becomes almost 80% of all of the fuel used in Vancouver, the Lower Mainland, Vancouver Island, is in fact from deliveries coming in from Edmonton. And so, I don't think it takes a lot of rhetoric to convince people of how serious something like this can be. And as I mentioned earlier, I think given those numbers, I think it's pretty clear that most people have to understand the significance and importance and vitality of the Trans Mountain expansion. And thankfully, the federal government chose that one to back. It's too bad it didn't see same for Northern Gateway or Energy East at a time in which we are seeing other threats. Where I am here in Ontario, Line 5 continuing with the state of Michigan. And of course, the need to respond to absolute use by India and China and other countries around the world coal is an alternative to natural gas. Coal is an alternative to cleaner produced oil. All of these things, I think, suggest that the federal government may have gotten it wrong, but activists locally really don't care about that. What it also, by the way, drove home, Danielle, and I think this is something that happened a few years ago when activists were hanging from the Workers' Bridge in the Burrard Inlet, trying to block access to oil getting into the Parkland refinery and the other terminals, the gasoline for the other terminals. That Vancouver 2 years ago almost came to a standstill. They would have had zero or very little in the way of fuel. So, to use David Yeager's comments, the miracle of hydrocarbons, I think, is and fossil fuels is something that I think we can't take for granted, and they certainly can't now in British Columbia.
Give us an idea of when they're going to get that pipeline back up, because I don't know how, if you're relying for 2/3 of your fuel on this pipeline that's been shut down for going on 3 weeks. How are they making how are they making up the difference?
Well, they're progressing. I suspect that when I first heard it would be a week, I thought that was a little premature, and I discussed this with several media, suggesting it would be at least double that time. And there's a couple of reasons for it. I mean, you obviously, beyond the political pressure of making sure this thing has no trouble, and it's been a miracle in terms of its work over the past 60 years or so, since it was built in 1953, and the fact that it's a batched system where one day you might have oil, the next day diesel, the next day gasoline, and it cycles that way. It brings various fuels down in batches, makes it that you will need a lot more attention to make sure that it's up and running. Parts of that pipeline in areas where it were covered under snow. So, looking at it from the sky or walking over it may not give the impression of what the sophisticated piece of infrastructure that's underground. But I think the company's erring on the side of caution. Now, I did note something that surprised me is that the Pacific Northwest gasoline market, which basically controls all the price or sets the price discovery, the price signals for Oregon, for Washington State, and the Lower Mainland, never mentioned anything until yesterday. And then we saw a 2 cent a liter rise in gasoline prices as a result. So it looks like the longer the Trans Mountain Pipeline remains offline, other suppliers for both crude in Washington State and gasoline needs here in the Lower Mainland are going to become a growing concern. So I would expect perhaps another week, but even then, the Parkland refinery, which has been shut down now for the past week and a half, it's going to take 5, maybe 7 days to restart a refinery. You can't just turn on a switch and suddenly can, as it were, bend the molecules from oil into gasoline. These operate on a number of significant chemical processes that require heat above all, and that's going to take several days. So I don't see this really getting close to back to normal, assuming there's no more damage and flooding. I don't see us getting back to normal much before Christmas.
My goodness. Okay, can you give us an update on what is happening with Line 5? Is that under threat for real, or are people watching what is happening? I mean, we've had so many examples now: the Texas power grid failing, the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack, what's happening now in British Columbia with shortages and price spikes. You'd think that it would connect the dots for folks that we really do rely on this fuel, and there isn't an easy alternative for them. And yet we keep hearing that Line 5 might have its permit pulled.
Yeah, I mean, look, Eastern Canada, I'm here in Ontario. Almost all of our fuel comes from Line 5, which comes from Western Canada. And the state of Michigan is determined, along with its Attorney General, to shut that down. And they have activists and organizations, same crowd that has been bedeviling us here in Canada, saying we don't want this pipeline. We think it could leak, and if it leaks, that'll be it for the Great Lakes. It's understandable, except that the section of the lake has never leaked. It's actually 2 pipes, much thicker grade, and the carrier itself, Enbridge, wants to build another one to submerge it several meters under the lake bed, if you will. So there's no chance of anything striking it. And that, of course, is a different matter altogether. But legally, Michigan tried to say it's their jurisdiction. Enbridge pushed back and said it's federal jurisdiction, and they won. So the federal court does, in fact, in the United States, have something to say. Of course, the federal government is now finally, after several months of if not years, of my trying to plead to in my old days a gas buddy that there was a problem here. They finally moved and recognized and went back to the 1977 treaty on the movement of hydrocarbons across borders. So I think in that, I mean, it provides, relief in the sense that this is not going to be resolved overnight. But make no mistake, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Vice President of the Democratic Congress, very powerful person, is determined, in fact, to see that this thing is closed. And I suspect this is going to involve politically wrangling that's going to go on for several years. What it does do, however, beyond the threat, is provide us a unique opportunity, maybe here in Ontario, to use an expression, smarten up. Get the Energy East pipeline back up and running, because it already runs to Ontario as a natural gas conduit. Maybe that would be the way in which we should proceed. But again, in an environment where everybody is woke, no one wants to think about the practical reality of now. Maybe in Ontario we do need, unfortunately, a BC type of event to remind everyone here just how important pipelines are, especially this one, and why we need to have a fallback position, which we currently don't have.
Oh man, it would be devastating though for it to show. I don't know how easily it would be to make up that supply. Maybe give us an idea, because I thought that Quebec is now have over 50% of its supply comes from line 5 through line 9 to get to, because we did that reversal years ago. And I thought that that Ontario was very close, and then of course Eastern Canada needs propane, and aviation fuel needs to go to the Toronto Pearson Airport. So I don't know how easy it would be if line 5 shut down to be able to replace that.
Well, you'd have to truck it in from Alberta, which I don't think anybody wants to do. Nobody's prepared to do. It would damage the roads, damage the environment. As for rail, I mean, rail allocations are already used up. There is no real other pipelines that can do this unless you're prepared to squeeze somebody out and work it backwards through, say, through Detroit, or maybe there's really no other alternatives other than Line 5. What would it mean? Well, the aviation sector, Pearson Airport would shut down. There'd be no more fuel for it. You'd have to barge some of the stuff in on the Great Lakes. Got news for you. It's closed. It closes several months of the year. So I don't think any of the alternatives really, stand up. But what we've lost sight of here is energy security. The United States has certainly lost it, but it's about to rediscover that. And I think you're seeing that in terms of not just pricing, but pressure on the Biden administration that's likely to lose the midterms. And on gasoline alone. That's one thing I love about the Americans, in my experience working with the media down there. They take their energy costs very seriously. Whereas in Canada, you can bamboozle people. It's about the climate, or, you should be happy you get a bit of money on your carbon tax, or don't worry about losing $150 billion in investment in the oil and gas sector. Your number one wealth generator. Things look after themselves. The government will be there. They can print money. Anyways, I'm being cynical, but I'm also being forceful, because I recognize just how far we've gone to the point where we've denigrated a sector of the economy that's now having a rather sobering effect, I think, on the lives of Canadians. And
you point out something important, though.
To earn revenues and to be able to maintain energy security. It really brings us back to a time 20, 30 years ago when a much more enlightened generation really feared lights turning off, and relying on only one source like electricity wouldn't cut it.
You point out something important, though, that in the US, you can have an ideological leader, and if they go too far, there's a very quick corrective, because they do genuinely have the power of Congress to offset the power of the president. And so they just have, if some lunatic policy gets passed, they just have to wait for another year and they can reverse it. Whereas I don't know what we do to control lunatic policy here. I have a tweet that was sent to me that it's on Canada Buster. Greenpeace activist turned Minister of the Environment says the Liberals will eliminate fossil fuel production by 2030. Now, I don't know if they were just talking about Quebec or if that's aspirational to the rest of the country, but that is bananas. And that's part of the thing that makes us wonder what is the end game here with the Liberal government that we have, propped up by the Liberals and the NDs and the Bloc, with Quebec taking such aggressive stances against the fossil fuel development industry. Where is this all going?
Well, I think it is governed by a severe disconnect with reality. I mean, it's one thing to be aspirational, say this is where you want to go. It's quite another thing to say, make these kind of epithets saying that we're going to get rid of fossil fuels. Well, you can start that by shutting off your natural gas to keep your house warm. You can stop that by using these devices to communicate. You can stop that, by shutting down your petrochemical and textile sector, which relies on, the hydrocarbon sector. Last time I checked, if we do all these things in the timetable they're suggesting, and assuming there's no technologies to replace it, because there are not, and your willingness to basically defy the law of physics in order to achieve that, because where even the trendy folks out there, EVs are replete with the need for fossil fuel. What are they going to run on? Hemp. I mean, the fact is that we are quickly finding ourselves in a situation where reality is forcing many to finally recognize what these people are advocating. Apart from less population, and I'm being blunt about that. Bloomberg News, November the 19th, 2019, had that story. 12,000 climate scientists want us to control population. Beyond that, their recipe is to reduce the human condition to a point where we'll be living the state of nature, eating acorns, wearing animal skins, but no fires, because we are always concerned about the emissions that we'll do. And I'm here on this point, I can't be more emphatic, because I see these guys and they're fanatics. They're not attached to reality. There's a perception that the world is coming to an end in 10 years. I heard this garbage in 2008, and I heard that it was mendacious. It was fundamentally dishonest. And at the end of the day, it was meant to enrich certain people who could take advantage of the unregulated carbon credit market. They always had an angle, usually government subsidies. Pay me some money here so I can advocate for more extreme policies. That's what's governing this country. And I say that with my experience as 37 years in the Liberal Party, half of that as a member of Parliament, and studying this issue through and through. I am not convinced that they have the ultimate interests of the country at heart. I think it's really a very false signal. And when you have people like David Suzuki and others going around saying that be careful, if we don't get our way, we're going to blow things up. Well, if that's the kind of anarchy and vandalism that we're given to as a country, then we know that there's something highly suspect with their agenda.
I had really hoped that Jonathan Wilkinson, because he drives a hydrogen vehicle, I understand, I'd really hoped that there was some kind of breakthrough in looking at how the energy sector was transforming to meet zero emissions targets, whether through carbon capture, carbon technologies, so that we can use it for useful purposes, or we can store it, whether it's being able to move to hydrogen as one of our main fuels. But this idea that we're in this world of polarization, where you've got a minister actively talking about shutting down the biggest industry, employing the most people with the largest export value. Are we to take it seriously? I mean, it almost seems comical that we would have somebody in a position where they do have decision-making power being so capricious and reckless. I'm trying hard to process this, because it's the Liberals back in your day used to be very pragmatic. In fact, I was having a conversation with a conservative friend of mine. He said, well, if we have to look back on history, that Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin duo, they balanced the budget, and they were a pretty conservative bunch. But will we ever get back to that level of realism and pragmatism?
I think we will, the moment Canadians realize they can't make ends meet, and at the cost of their electricity, which has gone up to make a lot of people very rich on the green side. The cost of withholding, the production of energies like natural gas and oil through ESG mandates. The fact that there's really no alternative other than through subsidies. I think when people start to take a much harder look, I mean, we're just getting into winter, and we're just getting into this inflationary cycle. And yes, we can talk about supply chain issues, and yes, we can talk about, governments having to move towards less permissive, monetary policy. The Prime Minister knows anything about that. I think what we're going to see is a major pushback from Canadians who are saying, we can't afford this. Ipsos 3 did something very interesting last week for Global, and that was very telling. Finally, I mean, what we've been saying all along, 4 out of 5 Canadians say, I can't afford. Half the people out there are $200 away from bankruptcy, and the 4 out of 5 are saying the cost of inflation is a burden. It's bigger than climate. It's bigger than the pandemic. I mean, those are all issues that continue to get a disproportionate amount of attention by opinion leaders. But in fact, it is the lot of the people. And the sooner or later politicians realize just how angry people are out there. It'll only take one party and one leader to, basically serve as a lightning rod and say, I think we need to make this as an issue. We'll deal with the rest later, because there is no existential crisis. And if you believe there is, then, fine. That's your view. But I think our politicians are quickly coming to a point where they may very well be reconnected, as I was when I was an MP, with the idea that massive deficits, unemployment, structural unemployment, stagflation is not just a killer for the economy, it's a killer for politicians. And Danielle, you know that as well as I do.
Oh, isn't that the truth?
This is, I think this is why we've had it so good for the past few years. They've been able to sort of freelance and provide carefree policies that never really had consequence. Climate policies are now having massive consequences, and they're affecting Canadians who are finally, I think, starting to wake up, including my neighbors here in Toronto.
Well, tell me what you think. I talked to a Toronto environmentalist earlier this week, because I still feel like there is, especially in the urban environment and the further east you go, this is definitely true. So Montreal and Toronto in particular, but we're seeing it in Calgary and Edmonton as well. We're seeing it in Vancouver. I've even been told that it's emerging in Regina and Saskatoon. The larger the center, the more this idea that you can achieve the unachievable seems to have set in, that all of this can be done by 2030. Now, I think a lot can be done by 2050. I think the whole world could be entirely different by 2050. But if you're trying to put in place edicts that will accelerate this transition to 2030 on technologies that don't even exist yet, and approval processes that take years to get approved. I mean, I don't even know how many wind farms and solar panels we would need to install to be able to completely replace fossil fuels by 2030. But you just have to think that through and realize it is impossible. But yeah. I'm wondering where the common ground is. I mean, I'm trying to find some environmentalists who are pragmatic, who realize that being able to develop any of these solutions at scale requires the kind of businesses that do major mega projects, and the energy industry is expert at that. But is there some common ground? Maybe with the Sapporo Bermans and the David Suzuki's, you won't ever be able to find some area of agreement. But how do we deal with the issues of affordability, deal with issues of energy security, keep our industry producing money, but also address the environmental concerns that are put on the table? What's the secret formula? Do you have it?
I think it is a little bit of, not all wisdom is new wisdom. I mean, we've had nuclear for a very long time. My old riding had it in Pickering, first commercial use in North America. I think the issue and the buzzword will quickly develop to diversity. So whether that's hydrogen, whether that's oil, whether that's natural gas to produce that hydrogen, whether that's nuclear, whether that's a continuation of what we've done very well in for well over 120 years, that's hydroelectric, depending on the topography of regions of the country. The eclectic variety of a menu of energy possibilities and our continuation in terms of improvement, not against a time clock or a politician's stopwatch, but practically, obeying the laws of science and physics in terms of our ability to do certain things and to harness certain types of energy. I think that's where we have to go. Putting all our eggs in one electrification basket, which is the object of net zero 2050, is insane. There's no way you would want to do something like that. Give an example. What happens if you have an ice storm in Ottawa, like we did in 1999? Back then, we weren't saying it was because of climate. It was just because we had an ice storm, and these things happen every once in a while, and you knock out your electrical grid. At least you have something to fall back on. You have your propane, you have your natural gas. Same thing for Nova Scotia. Hurricane hit there in 2017 summer, knocked out, again, the electrical grid. So I think the compromise, if people are willing to compromise, because there's a lot of very hard heads on this, and I got to tell you, on the other side, I've never seen so many, companies involved with natural gas and oil twisting themselves into pretzels to try to provide accommodation. But the other side doesn't see it that way. Their mantra is buried in the ground. It's almost like this Marxist ideology that you have to knock down the things that are very important to keep our national stability and the ability for people to improve their life through affordability and through the sharing of cheap, abundant energy. I think we have to sit down and have an adult discussion that there is reality and there is fantasy. And Canada was not founded on a world of magic and make-believe. Were it so, we would still, as Voltaire used to call it in French, quelques bancs de fléaux, and this would just be a bank of snow and a bunch of trees and rocks. We're more than that, and we've become more than that. We've become the most enviable country to live in the world, by our ability to harness those resources and to use them responsibly. And let's have our teachers across this country finally celebrate this very important hydrocarbon, because we are doing much better. Our emissions are down, and they can go a lot further. But this is, again, it's not going to happen just because a couple of trendy folks want to make a point, dangle from bridges or dangle from the CN Tower, later to become ministers and call themselves activists. I think this kind of wokery and jokery has no place among those of us who want a serious discussion about all of the objectives. But that is not going to be achieved by coming out with ludicrous lines in the sand about what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and of course never achieve it.
Totally agree with you. You know, Dan, we had a board meeting yesterday. We were talking about trying to get a trade mission going to Ontario and Quebec. And if we do manage to do that, I'd love to be able to connect with you and see who we can talk to, who are of like mind, like you are in Ontario.
Yeah.
I always love meeting people who see the world the same way we do, even though they come from a different part of the country. You've been such a champion for smart, sensible energy policy. And thank you so much for the work you do.
Great to be here, Danielle. Thanks for having me. I look forward to that.
You got it. That is Dan McTeague. Once again, he is the president of Canadians for Affordable Energy, just giving a bit of an update on where things are with the lay of the land. And it looks kind of bleak. I mean, I was hoping that we would see some kind of practicality set in with the federal government, especially with all the challenges that we faced on energy security, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So we got a lot of work to do. That is it for today. We will be back at it again next week. I'm Danielle Smith, president of Alberta Enterprise Group. Thank you so much for tuning in today.